Picture a woman 30,000 years before Christ, somewhere in what we now call Siberia, hunched over an animal hide as winter darkness closes in. Her hands move with practiced speed, a bone needle pulling sinew through leather. And here's the thing that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. She knows something that most modern tailors have forgotten, that every hole she punctures weakens the hide, that 5 perfectly placed stitches will outlast 50 careless ones. Think about that for a second. This woman, living in conditions that would kill most of us within hours, has figured out something about material science that wouldn't be formally understood until we had computers and stress analysis software. Her family's survival depends on seams that won't burst when her husband drags a seal across the ice, when her daughter climbs rocks gathering eggs, when the screaming winds of January test every join. She is, in a very real sense, humanity's first engineer solving problems of material science with nothing but observation, memory, and the accumulated wisdom passed from her mother's hands to hers. Now, the bone needle itself, we need to talk about this because it's genuinely revolutionary. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans survived by draping animal skins over their bodies, holding them with cords and pins. Crude but functional. But around 30,000 before Christ, someone, and let's be honest, it was probably a woman, carved the first-eyed needle from bone, small enough to pass through hide, strong enough not to break, smooth enough to pull thread without shredding it. This tool, barely longer than your finger, opened the frozen north to human habitation. The implications are staggering when you think about it. Suddenly, people could create fitted garments that trapped warm air, could seal seams against rain and snow, could tailor clothing to specific tasks. The archaeological record tells this story beautifully. Needles appear in the sites, and shortly after, humans spread into territories that absolutely should have killed them. We're talking about places where unprotected skin freezes in minutes, where winter lasts 8 months, where survival seems impossible. But with that bone needle and the knowledge of how to use it, humans conquered the ice. And these ancient seamstresses discovered through brutal necessity what modern materials scientists now confirm with computers and testing equipment, that fabric strength depends not on how many stitches you make, but where you place them and how you tension them. Let me give you an example that really drives this home. Sinew, their primary thread, swells when wet. A woman working with seal hide learned to space her stitches, knowing they would expand and lock together when waves crashed over a kayak. She understood stress points in ways that would make a modern engineer nod in approval, where a parka would pull when arms reached overhead, where a boot would flex with each step. She placed her stitches there and nowhere else. Because here's the counterintuitive part that trips up modern thinking. Excessive stitching meant excessive holes, meant perforations that would tear like a postage stamp. Her descendants wore clothes she made and survived because she understood that less could be more. That restraint was strength, that every intervention had costs as well as benefits. As the ice retreated and civilizations rose, textile work became the foundation of urban life itself. In Egypt, 3,000 years before Christ, the cultivation of flax created the linen that wrapped pharaohs and clothed farmers alike. Egyptian women spinning and weaving in courtyards developed techniques perfect for linen's specific properties. Linen is strong but inflexible, so stitching had to accommodate its stiffness without fighting it. They created the running stitch with strategic backstitch reinforcement, placing extra stitches only where stress demanded them. The priestesses who prepared burial shrouds knew their work would be examined in eternity. Think about working under that kind of pressure. They made seams that have lasted 5,000 years. 5,000 years still intact in museum collections today. You can go see them, touch them if the curator trusts you. 5 millennia later, and the seams hold. The Greeks, characteristically, took a completely different philosophical approach. Rather than elaborate stitching, they mastered draping and strategic pinning. The peplos and chiton required minimal sewing, and I mean minimal. A woman could create a garment with fewer than 20 stitches, all at crucial stress points along the shoulders and sides. The philosophy matched Greek ideals of elegant simplicity. Achieve your goal with minimum intervention. Let the material's nature guide your design. Greek women understood that excessive stitching restricted movement and weakened fabric. They trusted in gravity, body heat, and a handful of perfectly placed stitches. Rome conquered 3 continents on the backs of its textile production. Let that sink in for a moment. The legions marching to Britain, Germania, and Parthia wore tunics sewn by Roman and provincial women who understood that a soldier's clothing must survive not just combat but endless marching, sleeping rough, and brutal weather. The women in workshops from Rome to Syria developed the fell seam, a technique that enclosed raw edges within the seam itself, creating strength while using every scrap of precious fabric. A Roman soldier's tunic carried perhaps 200 stitches total. 200! But it would serve him for years of campaigning. The women who made them knew that overstitching created rigidity, chafing, and weakness. They stitched enough, and no more. That phrase should probably be carved in stone somewhere. Enough, and no more. Meanwhile, in China, the secret of silk created an economic empire that would last millennia. From approximately 3000 before Christ, Chinese women cultivated silkworms, reeled their cocoons, and wove fabrics so fine that Roman senators would pay its weight in gold. The penalty for revealing silk production methods was death. This wasn't just valuable knowledge, this was strategic national power wrapped up in thread and needles. Chinese needleworkers developed techniques optimized for silk's unique properties, its strength, despite delicacy, its tendency to show every imperfection. They created nearly invisible stitches spaced to maintain silk's drape and sheen. A silk robe for an emperor might contain thousands of embroidery stitches for decoration, but pay attention to this distinction. The structural seams, the ones that actually held the garment together, used remarkable economy. Just enough tension to join the fabric, never so much as to pucker or strain it. The Silk Road carried more than goods, it carried knowledge. Persian merchants learned Chinese techniques and adapted them to their own materials. Byzantine rulers actually kidnapped Chinese silk workers, literally kidnapped them, establishing silk production in Constantinople around 550 after Christ. Each culture added refinements, tweaked the methods, solved new problems, but the core principle remained constant across 5,000 years and 3 continents. Understand your material intimately, place stitches strategically at stress points, resist the urge to overwork the fabric. This wisdom, refined across millennia by countless anonymous hands, would reach its absolute peak in the workshops of medieval Europe. And when it did, those medieval seamstresses would create garments whose seams would outlast empires, survive centuries, and eventually baffle modern scientists trying to understand how fewer stitches could possibly create superior strength. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand why medieval methods worked so extraordinarily well, we need to see those methods in action in the guild halls and castle towers, where craft knowledge reached its zenith, where an 8-year-old girl could begin a journey that would make her a master of techniques we're only now beginning to rediscover. In the year 1200, after Christ, a young girl in Bruges began her apprenticeship to a master seamstress. She was 8 years old. 8. For the next 7 years, she would learn not just how to stitch, but why. The accumulated knowledge of generations distilled into principles that could make or break a guildmaster's reputation. She learned to read fabric the way a sailor reads the sea, feeling for the grain, testing the give, understanding where stress would concentrate when a body moved inside the clothing. She learned that thread, though it looked uniform, varied in strength along its length, and that a skilled seamstress could feel these variations between her fingers and adjust tension accordingly. She learned what I'd call the sacred truth of medieval textile work, that mindless quantity was the mark of an amateur, while strategic economy was the signature of a master. Let's set the scene here, because the medieval period, roughly 1000 to 1500 after Christ, represented the golden age of hand-stitching technique. And it wasn't random. The economic and social conditions created perfect circumstances for optimization. Fabric was expensive. We're talking a length of quality wool representing weeks of a laborer's wages. Silk cost even more, astronomically more. Thread had to be spun by hand, a time-consuming process that anyone who's tried it can tell you is absolutely brutal on the hands and patience. Needles, made by specialized craftsmen, were valuable enough to list in wills and inventories. Your grandmother literally left you her needles in her will. These constraints made efficiency not just desirable but economically essential. A seamstress who could create durable seams with half the thread of her competitor could charge the same price while doubling her profit, or undercut prices while maintaining margin. The math worked both ways, and everyone in the business understood it. The guild system ensured knowledge, preservation, and refinement. In cities from Florence to Paris to London, textile guilds controlled who could practice the craft, what standards they must meet, and how knowledge transferred from master to apprentice. A girl entering apprenticeship at 8 might become a journeywoman at 15, and if truly skilled, a master by her mid-20s, but only after producing a masterwork judged by the guild's most experienced members. This system created what modern businesses would call quality control and continuous improvement. Each generation learned from the last, and the best innovations spread through the guild network while inferior techniques died out. It was ruthlessly efficient in its own way. Now let's talk about the backstitch, because this became the foundation of medieval structural sewing. Unlike a simple running stitch that could unravel from a single break, the backstitch created interlocking stitches that distributed stress. The technique was elegant. Needle forward 2 steps, back 1 step, forward 2 steps, back 1 step. Each stitch overlapped its predecessor, creating a seam nearly as strong as the fabric itself. But here's where medieval seamstresses showed their sophistication. They didn't backstitch continuously. That would waste thread and create excessive perforations. Instead, they used strategic placement, backstitching at stress points like armholes and side seams, running stitches with occasional backstitches in areas of lower stress. A woman's everyday kirtle might have continuous backstitching only at the shoulders and underarms, with simple running stitches everywhere else. Using perhaps 60% of the thread, a modern machine would consume while creating a more durable garment. The fell seam represented another medieval innovation born of economic necessity. When cutting fabric for a tunic, every scrap mattered. The fell seam allowed a seamstress to create a strong join while enclosing all raw edges, preventing fraying without requiring additional fabric for hems or facings. The technique involved stitching 2 pieces together, then folding the seam allowance over itself and stitching it down, encapsulating the raw edges completely. The result was a seam that could withstand the friction of armor, the strain of labor, and years of wear and washing. The seams of a knight's padded gambeson, sewn with fell seams throughout, might survive decades of combat, while the linen itself wore away around them. Think about that. The fabric fails before the seams do. Medieval women understood variable tension in ways that modern sewing machines cannot replicate. A machine produces uniform tension on every stitch, its virtue and its limitation. A skilled hand seamstress. Varied tension based on fabric properties and anticipated stress. Stitching a sleeve into an armhole, she pulled tighter at the top where the arm lifted, eased the tension at the underarm where flexibility mattered. Working with linen, which has no stretch, she used looser tension than with wool, which has natural give. Joining different fabrics linen lining to wool outer garment, she calibrated tension to match their different properties, preventing puckering or pulling. This adaptive intelligence, responsive to material reality, created seams that moved with the body instead of restricting it. You can't program that into a machine. Not then, not now. The monasteries and convents served as centers of textile excellence. Religious orders needed vestments, altar cloths, and liturgical garments of the highest quality, made to last generations. A chasuble sewn in 1200 might still be in use in 1400. Monastic seamstresses had time that commercial workers. They lacked their labor was devotional, not purely economic. They pushed techniques to their limits, creating ecclesiastical garments whose seams were nearly invisible, whose structural integrity was absolute. When a noble woman donated a silk altar cloth to her local monastery in 1320, the nuns who assembled it used approximately 2,000 stitches to create a cloth 4 feet square. A modern machine would use 5,000 stitches for the same piece. 600 years later, when examined by textile conservators, the medieval cloth seams remained perfect, while the silk itself had begun to deteriorate from age. The seams outlasted the fabric. Again, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen of France and then England in the 1200s, maintained workshops at her courts where the finest needlework in Europe was produced. The women in her service created the elaborate embroidered surcoats that crusaders wore over armor, the heraldic banners that identified nobles in battle, the clothing that represented royal power and wealth. These were not simple garments. A surcoat might feature gold thread embroidery, precious stones, and silk panels. Yet the structural seams underneath all this decoration followed the same principles as a peasant's tunic: strategic stitch placement, appropriate tension, respect for the fabric's integrity. The distinction between decorative and structural stitching was absolute. Embroidery could be lavish, unlimited, extravagant, but the seams that held the garment together were economical, efficient, and precisely calculated. By 1400 after Christ, the principles of efficient, durable stitching had reached their peak. A master seamstress in Florence or Bruges possessed knowledge refined across 4 centuries of guild practice, itself built on techniques stretching back to ancient Rome and beyond. She could look at a bolt of fabric and know exactly how many stitches it would require, where stress would concentrate, how the prass, the wearer's body, would test each seam. She wasted nothing. Not thread, not fabric, not motion. Her efficiency was the product of sophistication, not simplicity, and within a few centuries, nearly all of this knowledge would be lost, swept away by machines that could stitch faster, but couldn't think, couldn't feel, couldn't adapt. The Industrial Revolution was coming, and it would change everything. In 1790, an Englishman named Thomas Saint sketched designs for a machine that could stitch leather. He never built a working model. In 1810, German inventor Balthasar Krems patented a machine for sewing caps. It failed commercially. In 1830, French tailor Barthélemy Thimonier created a machine that actually worked, so well that French tailors, fearing for their livelihoods, burned his factory to the ground. Let that image sit with you for a moment. Craftsmen so terrified of technological change that they resorted to arson. The idea was inevitable, but the world resisted. Machine stitching represented not just new technology, but a fundamental challenge to centuries of accumulated craft knowledge and the economic systems built around it. The breakthrough came in 1846, when American Elias Howe patented a sewing machine with a lock-stitch mechanism. His machine used 2 threads, one from a needle, one from a bobbin underneath the fabric that interlocked with each stitch. Unlike hand stitching that could vary in tension and placement, the lock stitch was uniform, mechanical, and fast. Within a decade, Isaac Singer improved the design and, more importantly, the marketing. By 1860, Singer sewing machines were selling worldwide, promoted with payment plans that made them accessible to ordinary households. The revolution had begun, and once it started, it moved with breathtaking speed. The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. A skilled seamstress could complete perhaps 50 stitches per minute by hand, working at a pace she could sustain for hours. A sewing machine operator could complete 1,000 stitches per minute. 1,000. The economic math was brutal. One machine operator could produce what 20 hand sewers produced. Workshops that adopted machines could undercut competitors' prices by 30 to 50% while increasing profits. By 1870, hand sewing for anything but luxury goods or home use was economically obsolete in industrialized nations. 3 generations of accumulated guild knowledge rendered worthless in less than 30 years. But the speed came with hidden costs that wouldn't become apparent for decades. Machine stitching was uniform, every stitch exactly the same length, exactly the same tension. This uniformity was its great advantage for assembly line production, but it eliminated the adaptive intelligence of hand stitching. A machine couldn't feel when fabric needed looser tension, couldn't vary stitch placement based on stress, points, couldn't adjust technique for different materials. Early machines could only sew straight lines, forcing garment design to adapt to machine capabilities rather than body ergonomics. And machines created far more perforations than hand stitching. That 1,000 stitches per minute capability meant that a machine-sewn seam might have 4 times as many holes as a hand-sewn equivalent. 4 times. Remember what we learned about perforations and weakness. The ancient seamstresses knew. Medieval masters knew. The machines didn't care. The guild system collapsed within a generation. Why would anyone pay for 7 years of apprenticeship when a factory worker could learn machine operation in a week? The master seamstresses of 1850, carrying knowledge refined across centuries, found their expertise suddenly worthless. Some adapted, opening custom workshops serving only the wealthy. Most simply aged out of the trade, and when they died, they took their knowledge with them. The mother-to-daughter transmission chains that stretched back to prehistory broke, just snapped. By 1900, most women in industrialized nations could operate a sewing machine, but few understood the principles that made hand-stitching superior for durability. The knowledge was gone, and nobody seemed to notice or care. The American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 accelerated the transformation. The Union needed hundreds of thousands of uniforms, quickly. Government contracts went to whoever could deliver fastest. Factories with dozens of sewing machines won those contracts. The Confederacy, with less industrial capacity, relied more heavily on hand sewing by women at home, but they lost the war. And in the popular imagination, mechanization became associated with progress and victory, hand sewing with backwardness and defeat. History is written by the winners, and the winners had sewing machines. The world wars completed the process. By 1914, virtually all military uniforms, parachutes, tents, and equipment came from industrial sewing. Factories ran 24 hours a day. Women who might have learned traditional hand sewing from their mothers instead learned machine operation in wartime training programs. The machines got faster, more specialized, more efficient. A 1943 parachute factory could produce 500 parachutes per day, each with thousands of machine stitches. Hand sewing such volume would have required an army of seamstresses. The war effort seemed to prove definitively that machines were superior. Case closed, discussion over. Yet evidence was accumulating that something had been lost. Museum curators noticed that medieval garments, excavated from graves or preserved in church treasuries, remained structurally sound after 500 or 600 years. The fabric might be fragile, the colors faded, but the seams held. Meanwhile, factory-made clothing from 1900 showed serious deterioration by 1950. The seams failed first, threads breaking, stitches pulling out, the perforation lines tearing, like perforated paper. By the late 20th century, planned obsolescence became explicit strategy. Why make a garment that lasts 20 years when you can make one that lasts 3 years, sell it cheaper, and sell the replacement? The economic incentives had reversed completely. Medieval seamstresses optimized for maximum lifespan, industrial production optimized for minimum acceptable lifespan, and consumers, who'd forgotten what quality looked like, accepted it as normal. The scientific understanding came late. In 1992, textile researchers at the University of Alberta tested medieval garments from museum collections, comparing their seam strength to modern equivalents. The results shocked them. 500-year-old seams, with half as many stitches, tested stronger than modern machine seams. The researchers discovered that excessive perforations created stress concentration points. Under tension, modern seams failed catastrophically once one stitch broke. Stress concentrated on the next, which broke, creating a cascading failure, like dominoes. Medieval seams, with strategic stitch placement and variable tension, distributed stress more evenly. When one stitch failed, the others compensated. The medieval seamstress's intuitive understanding of stress distribution matched what computers could model. By 2000, museums worldwide held garments that told the same story. The Victoria and Albert Museum in London displayed 14th century tunics with perfect seams. The Metropolitan Museum in New York showed 13th century silk garments whose structural stitching remained intact. The Textile Museum in Washington examined Coptic textiles from 5th century Egypt with seams still strong after 1500 years. Meanwhile, in ordinary closets, dresses from 1980 fell apart at the seams. The evidence was incontrovertible. The old ways produced superior results, but the knowledge of how to achieve them had largely vanished, lost in the rush for speed, efficiency, and profit. And that brings us to one of the most fascinating developments of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the rediscovery. In 1973, a group of history enthusiasts in England founded the Medieval Reenactment Society. Their goal was simple: recreate medieval life as accurately as possible, from combat to cooking to crafts. When they tried to make authentic medieval clothing using modern techniques, the garments failed immediately. Seams burst during sword practice. Fabric tore at stress points. Nothing held up to actual use. So they began researching medieval techniques, learning from museum pieces, experimenting with different stitches and placements. Within a few years, they had rediscovered what the guilds knew: that strategic, minimal stitching produced stronger garments than machine density. Not by a little, by a lot. The movement spread. By the 1980s, living history groups across Europe and America were producing garments that matched medieval durability. A hand-sewn tunic made using 14th century techniques would survive years of weekend events, hundreds of hours of wear, and countless washings. Machine-made reproductions failed within months. Word spread through the communities. The medieval methods weren't primitive, they were sophisticated. This realization sparked serious academic interest. Textile historians began systematically documenting traditional techniques before the last practitioners died, because time was running out. The women who'd learned hand sewing from their grandmothers were in their 70s and 80s. Another decade, and the living transmission would end completely. Sarah Thursfield, a British textile historian, published The Medieval Tailor's Assistant in 1991, the first comprehensive guide to historical sewing techniques in decades. She had spent years examining medieval garments in museums, sketching seam construction, counting stitches, analyzing thread paths. Her book revealed the logic behind medieval methods: the backstitch used at stress points, the running stitch in low-stress areas, the fell seam for maximum durability with minimum fabric waste. Costume designers and historical clothiers adopted her methods, discovering that garments sewn this way simply lasted longer. The evidence was undeniable once you actually tested it. The science caught up with practice. Materials engineers at North Carolina State University ran computer stress analysis on different seam types in 2005. They modeled medieval backstitch placement versus modern machine stitching under various loads and tensions. The simulations confirmed what medieval seamstresses knew: strategic stitch placement with variable spacing distributed stress more effectively than uniform, dense stitching. The perforations from modern machine stitching created what engineers call stress risers, points where force concentrated and failure began. Medieval seams, with fewer perforations strategically placed, avoided this weakness. The computer models validated 8 centuries of craft knowledge. The slow fashion movement, emerging in the 2000s, embraced traditional techniques as part of its broader critique of disposable consumer culture. Designers like Alabama Charnin built entire brands around hand-stitching, marketing garments that would last decades rather than seasons. Her workers used running stitches with strategic backstitches, creating seams that matched medieval durability while achieving a distinctive aesthetic. Customers paid premium prices. A hand-stitched dress might cost $500 compared to $50 for a machine-made equivalent, but the garment would outlast 10 factory pieces. The economics made sense when you calculated cost per wear over years instead of months. In Japan, the ancient art of sashiko decorative reinforcement stitching experienced revival. Japanese textile artists recognized the parallels between their traditional techniques and medieval European methods. Both used strategic stitch placement to reinforce stress points while maintaining flexibility. Both prioritized durability over speed. Both embedded cultural values in every stitch. Sashiko workshops spread globally, teaching the philosophy that visible mending and reinforcement were marks of respect for materials and labor, not poverty or neglect. The movement called visible mending turned repair into art, celebrating clothes that lasted and carried history. Your jeans showed where you'd lived, what you'd done, how you'd cared for them. London's Savile Row, legendary street of bespoke tailors, maintained hand-stitching traditions throughout the industrial era. Master tailors like Anderson and Shepherd and Huntsman, they continued to hand-stitch critical seams in suits, costing thousands of pounds. Their clients, executives, nobles, celebrities, paid premium prices for garments that would maintain shape and structure for decades. The tailors could explain exactly why hand-stitching worked better. Variable tension allowed fabric to move with the body, strategic stitch placement prevented stress concentration, and the reduced perforations maintained fabric integrity. A Savile Row suit might contain 3,000 hand stitches alongside machine work, but those hand stitches were placed precisely where they mattered most. Not everywhere, just where they needed to be. Academic programs began teaching historical textile techniques. The University of Southampton launched a textile conservation program in 2010 that required students to master medieval stitching methods. The Royal School of Needlework in London expanded its courses on traditional techniques. These programs recognized that understanding historical methods wasn't mere antiquarianism, it was essential knowledge for conserving priceless historical garments and for understanding why modern textiles failed so predictably. The environmental movement provided new urgency to old knowledge. Fast fashion's waste streams 80 billion garments produced globally per year. Most disposed within months created catastrophic environmental costs. Activists pointed to medieval principles as a solution: design for durability, repair rather than replace, value quality over quantity. The European Union began considering right-to-repair legislation requiring garments to be repairable, which meant seams that could be opened and restitched rather than machine-locked structures impossible to alter. Medieval techniques, designed for a world where fabric was precious and waste unthinkable, suddenly looked not backward but forward. Contemporary brands began marketing hand-stitching as premium feature. Outlier, a new York-based technical clothing company, offered hand-stitched reinforcements at stress points. Patagonia's Worn Wear program taught customers to repair garments using simple hand-stitching. Son de Flor, a Spanish brand, produced entirely hand-stitched garments using traditional techniques, explicitly marketing the medieval principle: fewer stitches, strategically placed, creating superior strength. The market demonstrated that consumers would pay for durability when they understood the value proposition. When you explained why it mattered, people cared. They wanted things that lasted. They were tired of throwing clothes away. The lesson extends beyond clothing. The medieval seamstress's principle: achieve your goal with minimum intervention. Place your effort precisely where it matters. Understand, your materials intimately applies to engineering, medicine, business, and life. Modern culture often equates more with better. More features. More inputs. More complexity. Medieval textile. Work proves that sophistication can mean doing less but doing it perfectly. Those 500-year-old seams, still strong with half the stitches modern tailors use, represent not primitive simplicity, but advanced optimization refined across generations. Today, when someone picks up a needle and thread to repair a torn seam, they participate in knowledge chains stretching back 30,000 years. The bone needles of Siberia, the linen shrouds of Egypt, the guild halls of Bruges, the monastery workshops of medieval England, all contributed to understanding that now seems obvious but took millennia to discover: that strength comes not from quantity, but from wisdom. The medieval seamstress, working by candlelight with precious fabric and hard-won thread, knew something worth remembering. She knew that every stitch should count, that respect for materials meant using exactly enough and no more, and that work done with understanding and care could outlast empires. Her hands are dust, but her seams remain.